What if everything you believe about how powerful systems collapse is only half the truth? What if the real cause is not war, not crisis, not external pressure, but something far more dangerous, something happening silently, inside the system itself? History teaches us about revolutions, conflicts, and dramatic turning points. But those are not where collapse begins. They are where collapse becomes visible. Because long before anything breaks in public, a much quieter process begins behind the scenes. A shift so small, it is almost impossible to notice. Accountability. The invisible structure that keeps power under control, where decisions are questioned and consequences still matter. When that structure is strong, systems don't just survive, they stay balanced. But when it starts to fade, something irreversible begins. Not suddenly, but step by step, decision by decision, moment by moment, until the system is no longer correcting itself. It is only continuing forward. And once you understand how this actually works, you will never look at power, history, or modern global systems the same way again. Because what you are about to see in this video is not just information. It is a pattern that repeats across time, across nations, and across every major system that has ever existed. And by the end of this video, your entire understanding of how systems rise and fall will change completely. To understand what happens when accountability fades, we first need to understand how it works when it is strong. Because accountability is not a single rule. It is a system within a system, a network of checks, balances, and responses. At its core, accountability means one thing: that power is observed, that decisions are reviewed, and that outcomes have consequences. In a functioning system, no single point holds unlimited control. Instead, responsibility is distributed. Different parts of the system monitor each other, not as opposition, but as balance. The structure appears in different forms. In governments, there are institutions. In organizations, there are processes. In societies, there are expectations. Each one plays a role. Each one maintains pressure on the others. Because without that pressure, imbalance begins. Consider how decisions are made. A decision is proposed. It is examined. It is questioned. And only then, it is accepted or adjusted. This process slows things down. But that is the point. Because speed, without review, creates risk. And risk, when repeated, becomes instability. So accountability introduces friction, deliberate friction, or resistance that prevents rapid imbalance. It is not designed to stop progress. It is designed to guide it. Now consider the opposite. A system where decisions are no longer questioned, where review becomes limited, where oversight weakens. At first, this may seem efficient. Faster decisions, less resistance, more control, but that efficiency comes at a cost. Because without review, errors go unnoticed. Without questioning, bias goes unchecked. Without consequences, patterns begin to repeat. And over time, those patterns accumulate, not in a visible way, but beneath the surface. This is where the shift begins, not with a crisis, but with a change in process. Because once accountability is reduced, the system no longer corrects itself. In the same way, It continues to operate, but without adjustment, without correction. And without correction, even small imbalances grow over time. This is why strong systems do not rely only on power. They rely on limits, on boundaries, on the ability to say, this needs to be reviewed. This needs to be questioned. This needs to change. When those mechanisms exist, the system adapts. It evolves. It remains stable, even under pressure. But when those mechanisms weaken, the system becomes rigid, less responsive, less aware of its own direction. And this is where the real risk begins, not because something has already failed, but because the system can no longer detect when it is going wrong. And once that awareness is lost, change continues without resistance, without correction, and often without being noticed. Accountability rarely disappears all at once. It fades gradually, almost invisibly. And in the beginning, the changes are small, so small that they are often ignored because the system still appears to function. Decisions are still being made. Structures still exist. Processes still continue. From the outside, nothing seems broken. But beneath that surface, something has already started to shift. The first signs are not dramatic. They are subtle. A question that is not asked. A decision that is not reviewed. A mistake that is not corrected. Individually, these moments seem insignificant, but together, they begin to form a pattern. And patterns are what shape direction. One of the earliest signs is silence, not the absence of sound, but the absence of challenge. When fewer people question decisions, the system loses feedback. And without feedback, it loses awareness. Another sign is normalization. Things that once felt unusual begin to feel routine. Actions that once required justification are no longer explained. And over time, standards begin to shift, not through official change, but through repetition. What is repeated becomes accepted. What is accepted becomes expected. And what is expected no longer stands out. This is how accountability fades, not through removal, but through adaptation. Another pattern appears in how responsibility is handled. When accountability is strong, responsibility is clear. Decisions are owned. Outcomes are addressed. But when accountability weakens, responsibility becomes unclear. Decisions are diffused. Outcomes are redirected. And over time, no single point feels fully responsible. This creates distance. Distance between action and consequence. And once that distance grows, behavior begins to change. Because when consequences are no longer immediate or no longer certain, they begin to matter less. And when consequences matter less, decisions change with them. This is not always intentional. It does not require a single moment or a single decision. It happens through accumulation, through repetition, through gradual shift. And this is what makes it difficult to detect, because there is no clear line where everything changes. There is only direction, a slow movement away from balance. And as long as the system continues to operate, that movement can go unnoticed. until the effects begin to appear. And by then, the process is no longer new. It has already been happening for a long time. So the real challenge is not identifying failure. It is recognizing the signs before failure becomes visible. Because once the signs are clear, the system is already. When accountability fades, the system does not collapse immediately. It continues. It functions from the outside. It may even appear stable. But internally, something has already changed. Because without accountability, there is no consistent correction. And without correction, imbalances begin to grow. At first, those imbalances are small, a decision that benefits a few over many, a process that favors speed over accuracy, a system that prioritizes control over balance. Individually, these shifts seem manageable, but systems are not shaped by single decisions. They are shaped by patterns. And when the same type of decision repeats over time, the pattern becomes structure. Once that happens, change becomes harder because the system is no longer responding to imbalance. It is reinforcing it. This is where consequences begin, not as a sudden event, but as a gradual transformation. Trust begins to shift, not always openly, but quietly. Confidence in decisions begins to weaken. Consistency begins to fade. And when consistency fades, predictability follows. Without predictability, systems become unstable, not visibly at first, but structurally. Another consequence is inefficiency. Not because the system has fewer resources, but because those resources are no longer used effectively. Decisions are made, but not optimized. Processes exist, but not refined. And over time, the gap between potential and performance continues to grow. Then comes fragmentation. Different parts of the system begin to move in different directions without coordination, without alignment, each part responding to its own pressures rather than the system as a whole. This creates internal tension, not always visible, but increasingly present. And as that tension grows, the system becomes less cohesive, less unified, less stable. At the same time, external challenges do not disappear. They continue. But now, the system faces them with reduced internal strength because its ability to respond has already been weakened. This is why history often shows that collapse is not caused by a single external force, but by internal conditions that made the system vulnerable. And once vulnerability exists, external pressure becomes more effective because the system is no longer operating at full strength. It is already compensating for internal imbalance. And this is where the outcome begins to take shape, not suddenly, but inevitably, as a continuation of what has already been happening. Because once accountability fades, the system is no longer fully in control of its direction. It is reacting rather than guiding. And over time, that difference becomes critical. So how does this pattern connect to the modern world? Because everything discussed so far is not limited to the past. These are not just historical ideas. They are ongoing processes. And today, they can be observed in different forms across different systems, including modern nations like the United States, a country with significant influence, global reach, and complex internal structures. From one perspective, it remains strong economically, technologically, militarily. But strength is not only about capability, it is also about direction. Because as history shows, systems do not change. Only when they are weak, they change, while they are still powerful. And this is where the earlier patterns matter. Questions around accountability are not unique to one nation. They appear in different ways, in different systems. Discussions about transparency, decision-making, and responsibility all reflect the same underlying idea: how well a system can correct itself, because that ability determines long-term stability. At the same time, global relationships continue to evolve, including tensions between the United States and Iran. These relationships are complex, shaped by history, strategy, and influence. But even here, the pattern remains the same. External tension does not define the outcome alone. Internal condition plays a critical role, because a system with strong accountability can adapt, can respond, can stabilize itself under pressure. But a system where accountability has weakened finds it harder to adjust direction, harder to respond effectively, harder to maintain balance. And this brings us back to the central idea. When accountability faded, it was not the end. It was the beginning of a process that unfolds over time, often quietly, often unnoticed, until its effects become impossible to ignore. So the question is not whether a system will face challenges, because all systems do. The real question is how it responds to them, and whether it can recognize its own direction before that direction becomes irreversible. Because in the end, history is not only about what has happened, it is about patterns, and whether those patterns are understood or repeated. If this made you think differently about systems' power and the future, then the next question is yours. What happens when accountability fades again, deep into the process?